Hello. In this video, you'll find the long and detailed summary of Victor Hugo's timeless classic Les Misérables, a story of justice, mercy, hope, and the deepest struggles of humanity. This masterpiece is considered one of the greatest novels in literary history. Let's dive into the unforgettable journey of Jean Valjean together. Jean Valjean was a poor peasant, raised in misery and hardship. Orphaned at a young age, he struggled to survive. When his sister and her children were starving, desperation drove him to steal a single loaf of bread from a bakery. To the strict laws of that time, this small act was seen as a grave crime. Jean Valjean was arrested and sentenced to 5 years of hard labor. But after several escape attempts and defiance against authority, his punishment was extended again and again. In the end, he spent 19 years as a convict in chains. The weight of the chains. Those long years in prison scarred both his body and his soul. Once a kind and compassionate man, Valjean grew hardened by the cruelty of the system. He came to believe that justice was nothing but injustice, that the poor were destined to be crushed under the weight of society. For him, the chains were not only on his wrists, they had sunk deep into his heart. By the time his release came, he no longer trusted people, society, or even himself, freedom and the branded identity. After 19 years, Jean Valjean was finally released, but freedom was not what he imagined. In his hands he carried a yellow passport, a document that identified him as an ex-convict. Wherever he went, this paper branded him as a criminal. He searched for work, but no one would hire a former prisoner. He asked for food and shelter, but was rejected and shunned. What he thought was freedom turned out to be another kind of prison, one without walls, but just as suffocating. The encounter with the bishop. Exhausted, hungry and desperate, Valjean knocked on doors, only to be turned away. Finally, he came to a church and met Bishop Myriel of Denler. Unlike everyone else, the bishop welcomed him with kindness, offering food and a place to rest. But Valjean, filled with bitterness and mistrust after years of suffering, betrayed this kindness. In the middle of the night, he stole the bishop's silverware and fled. Soon after, he was caught and brought back by the police. What happened next changed everything. Instead of condemning him, the bishop turned to the officers and said, "I gave him those silver pieces, and John, you forgot to take the candlesticks as well." Then, looking into Valjean's eyes, he added, "Brother, you no longer belong to evil. I have bought your soul. Use this silver to become an honest man." The spark of a new beginning. Those words pierced Jean Valjean's hardened heart. For 19 years, he had known only cruelty and hate. Now, for the first time, someone had shown him trust, mercy, and forgiveness. In that moment, something inside him began to shift. The man who had left prison full of anger found a new path opening before him, a path of compassion, conscience, and redemption. The mercy shown by Bishop Myriel marked the turning point in Jean Valjean's life. Instead of condemning him, the bishop saved him, gifting him the silver and giving him a second chance. This act of compassion shook Valjean to his very core. From that moment, he no longer wanted to be the man he once was. The bitterness and hatred forged during 19 years in chains had to be left behind, but the shadow of his past clung to him. The yellow passport in his possession branded him everywhere as an ex-convict. So he decided to reinvent himself. He took a new name, Madeleine. This name became the symbol of his rebirth and his determination to become a new man, his rise in Montreuil-sur-Mer. Jean Valjean settled in the small town of Montreuil-sur-Mer. There, he threw himself into work with tireless energy. He was diligent, honest, and inventive. At first, he opened a modest workshop, but soon expanded it into a thriving business. Over time, he became one of the town's most respected and prosperous men. The townspeople admired him. Many found employment through his factories, their families fed and clothed thanks to his efforts. He shared his wealth generously, helping the poor and supporting the sick. For the first time in years, Valjean felt that his life had meaning. Grateful for all he had done, the townspeople elected him as mayor. From then on, he was known as Monsieur Madeleine, a leader trusted and respected by all, the shadow of his past. Yet beneath this success, Valjean carried an unshakable fear, his past. No matter how much he tried to bury it, the yellow passport was a constant reminder of who he once was. Deep down, he lived in dread that one day the truth would come out and everything he had built would collapse. Still, the bishop's words echoed in his mind, "You must be an honest man now." For Valjean, this was not just a command, it was a promise he was determined to keep. The story of Fantine. It was during this period that Valjean's path crossed with that of Fantine, a young woman who had been deceived and abandoned. Unable to raise her little daughter Cosette alone, she left the child in the care of the unscrupulous Thénardier family while she worked to earn money. At first, Fantine found work in Montreuil-sur-Mer, but when her past was discovered, she was fired and shunned by society. Desperate to send money for her child, she sacrificed everything. She sold her hair, sold her teeth, and eventually her body. Her life spiraled into poverty and misery. When Valjean learned of her suffering, he was deeply shaken. Fantine's story reminded him of his own past, how society relentlessly crushed the weak and vulnerable. The awakening of conscience. Fantine's suffering stirred something powerful in Valjean's heart. The bishop's act of mercy had planted a seed, and now it was growing. He realized that his new life wasn't only about saving himself, it was about saving others too. For Fantine and her daughter Cosette, Valjean felt a new responsibility. His journey of redemption would not be complete until he offered to others the same chance for hope and dignity that had once been given to him. Fantine was once a young woman filled with dreams and innocence. She trusted a man she loved, hoping to build a happy life with him, but he abandoned her, leaving her with only her little daughter Cosette. In the eyes of society, Fantine was now a fallen woman. Being an unmarried mother in 19th-century France carried a heavy stigma. Finding work became nearly impossible. Desperation grew as she realized she couldn't raise her child alone, leaving Cosette behind. On a desperate journey, Fantine encountered the Thénardier family, innkeepers who seemed kind at first. Believing Cosette would be safe with them, she left her daughter in their care, promising to send money regularly. But the Thénardiers were greedy and cruel. Instead of treating Cosette with kindness, they forced the little girl to work like a servant, barely more than a child. Cosette carried buckets of water, scrubbed floors, and endured endless humiliation. She received no love, only scorn and abuse. Fantine's descent. Back in Montreuil-sur-Mer, Fantine managed to find work in a factory. For a brief moment, she thought she might rebuild her life, but when her secret, that she had a child out of wedlock, was discovered, the townspeople judged her harshly. She was fired and shunned. With no income, Fantine was forced to sacrifice everything. First she sold her beautiful hair, then she sold her front teeth. Finally, in her desperation to keep sending money for Cosette, she sold her own body. Each sacrifice broke her spirit a little more, but her love for her daughter pushed her forward. All she cared about was that Cosette survived. The cruelty of society. Fantine's suffering reflects the harshness of her world. Society turned its back on her, condemning her instead of offering compassion. Victor Hugo shows us how easily the vulnerable can be destroyed when society chooses judgment over mercy. Message: when society abandons its weakest, it loses its humanity. Jean Valjean's moral awakening. At this time, Monsieur Madeleine Jean Valjean, under his new identity, was the respected mayor of Montreuil-sur-Mer. When he learned about Fantine's suffering, he was deeply shaken. Fantine's tragic story reminded him of his own past. He too had been condemned by society for a desperate act. But unlike him, Fantine had no bishop to show her kindness, no second chance. Her suffering awakened Valjean's conscience even more. He realized that redemption wasn't just about saving himself. He had been given mercy, and now he felt compelled to extend that same mercy to others. He promised himself that he would protect Fantine's daughter Cosette and give her the love and safety her mother had been denied. Fantine's last breath. Sadly, Fantine's illness had progressed too far. Years of hunger, poverty, and despair had drained her life away. Even though Valjean tried to help her, Fantine lay dying, fragile and broken. With her final breath, she whispered one plea: "Take care of my little girl, take care of Cosette." Fantine's death marked another turning point for Jean Valjean. From that moment on, his life had a new purpose. He was no longer just seeking redemption for himself. He now carried the sacred duty of raising Cosette and giving her the love of a family. After Fantine's death, Jean Valjean set out immediately to fulfill his promise. His mission was clear: to find little Cosette and save her from the cruel Thénardier family. Cosette, still just a small child, lived like a servant in the inn. She carried heavy buckets of water through the cold forest at night, scrubbed floors, and endured endless humiliation. While the Thénardiers spoiled their own daughters, they treated Cosette with harshness and contempt. She was deprived of warmth, love, and even basic comfort. Victor Hugo describes her misery with heartbreaking detail, showing how poverty and lovelessness can crush the spirit of a child. Valjean's arrival. One cold Christmas night, Valjean arrived in the town. Amid the gloomy faces and the dark streets, he noticed a little girl struggling to carry water in her tiny frozen hands. Her eyes reflected both fear and silent resignation. That child was none other than Cosette, Fantine's daughter. Just as Julia had been a light of hope for Winston in 1984, Cosette became something new for Valjean, not just a child, but a symbol of his conscience, a living reminder of the bishop's gift of mercy, the moment of rescue. When Valjean entered the Thénardiers' inn, he witnessed the cruelty inflicted on Cosette. She wore a torn, dirty apron, her hands cracked from labor, her small body trembling with exhaustion. She was treated as less than human, denied affection, and fed only scraps. At that moment, Fantine's dying words echoed in his heart. "Take care of my little girl." Without hesitation, Valjean offered the Thénardiers money and took Cosette with him. For Cosette, who had already lost her mother, this was the first glimmer of true salvation. She had found someone who could be a father, a protector, and a source of love. A new beginning. With Cosette by his side, Valjean decided to dedicate his life to her. He would give her the warmth and safety she had never known. For Cosette, this meant stepping out of the darkness of cruelty into the light of love and hope. This chapter is one of the most moving in the entire novel. It marks the fulfillment of Fantine's last wish and gives Valjean's life a new, noble purpose. From this point on, his mission is not only his own redemption, but also the protection and happiness of Cosette, the rebirth of hope. Slowly the fear in Cosette's eyes began to fade, replaced by trust. In the bond forming between her and Valjean lay the seed of a new life. Years later, this bond would not only save Cosette, but also restore Jean Valjean's humanity completely. After rescuing little Cosette from the cruelty of the Thénardier, Jean Valjean stepped into a new life. His only mission now was to honor the promise he had made to Fantine, to protect and raise her daughter. To escape his past and hide from the watchful eyes of the law, he moved with Cosette to Paris. At first, life in the big city was not easy. Under his new identity, Monsieur Madeleine, Valjean tried not to draw attention. Still, with his strength, skill, and relentless work ethic, he managed to earn a living and provide for Cosette, the bond of father and daughter. Cosette had grown up without love, treated like a servant by the Thénardier. She was timid, fragile, and carried the scars of neglect. But in Valjean's care, she discovered something new: warmth, protection, and affection. Valjean did everything he could to heal her wounded heart. He bought her books, encouraged her to study, and introduced her to the beauty of the world beyond her pain. They walked together through the streets of Paris, and slowly, Cosette's fear began to fade. For Valjean, Cosette was no longer just a promise to a dying mother. She had become the very meaning of his life. Her smile lit up the darkness that had haunted him for so long, the shadow of the past, Javert's pursuit. Yet, their peace was fragile. From the shadows, Inspector Javert was still watching. For Javert, the law was absolute. In his eyes, a convict could never change, never truly become a good man. No matter how many good deeds Valjean performed, Javert would always see him as the man who once stole a loaf of bread. When Javert realized that Monsieur Madeleine was in fact Jean Valjean, his obsession grew stronger. He vowed to hunt him down, convinced that justice meant never allowing a criminal to escape punishment, a life on the run. The discovery forced Valjean and Cosette into a life of constant flight. They moved from one place to another, always hiding, always looking over their shoulders. For Valjean, the fear of capture was a heavy burden, but the thought of losing Cosette was unbearable. He told her not to be afraid, trying to shield her from the truth. But deep inside, Winston's fear of Big Brother seemed to echo in Valjean's own heart, the fear of being caught by a system that never forgives, hope born of love. Despite the dangers and hardships, Cosette's presence gave Valjean strength. Holding her small hand, seeing her eyes slowly regain their light, was worth every sacrifice. For Cosette, Valjean was no longer just a guardian, he was her true father. Victor Hugo shows us here how love and compassion can transform even the darkest soul. Jean Valjean, once hardened by prison and bitterness, was reborn through his love for Cosette. She was his hope, his redemption, and the reason he chose to keep living. At this stage of the novel, we are introduced to a new central character, Marius Pontmercy. He was born into an aristocratic family, but his life was marked by loss and conflict. His mother died when he was very young, and his father, a loyal officer of Napoleon, was forced into exile. Raised by his grandfather, who clung fiercely to royalist ideals, Marius grew up torn between two worlds. On the one hand, he was shaped by aristocratic tradition. On the other, he carried within him the memory and honor of his republican father. This inner conflict often left him restless and searching for meaning.
A chance meeting in the park. Marius's destiny took a sudden turn one ordinary day in a park. While strolling, his eyes fell upon a young woman, sitting quietly. She was no longer a child. She had grown into a graceful young lady. She was Cosette, the little girl once left in the hands of the Thénardiers, now living under the protection of Jean Valjean. At first, it was nothing more than stolen glances. Marius would find himself returning to the park at the same time each day, simply to see her from afar. Cosette, too, began to notice him. When their eyes met, her heart would beat faster, though she barely understood why. The spark of first love. Eventually, they spoke. A shy greeting, a fleeting smile, a hesitant word. From these small moments, something beautiful began to bloom. What they were discovering was new, fragile, and yet incredibly powerful. First love. For Cosette, who had grown up in fear and loneliness under the Thénardiers' cruelty, love was something she had only begun to understand through Valjean's kindness. But Marius opened a new chapter in her heart, a world of affection, dreams, and possibility. For Marius, Cosette was light itself. In her presence, the pain of his past and his inner conflict faded. She became the source of warmth and meaning in his life. Valjean's anxiety. But for Jean Valjean, this new bond between Cosette and Marius was deeply troubling. He loved Cosette more than anything, but that love came with a constant fear, the fear of losing her. On one hand, he wanted to keep his promise to Fantine, to ensure Cosette's happiness. On the other hand, the thought of her growing up and drifting away from him filled his heart with sorrow. It was as if he was being asked to give up the very reason for his own redemption, love and hope. Despite Valjean's unease, Cosette and Marius's love continued to flourish in secret. They met at night, whispered their dreams to each other, and built a fragile but radiant world of their own. In this chapter, Victor Hugo captures the essence of first love, pure, innocent, and yet filled with fear and uncertainty. Just as Zézé found meaning in his friendship with the orange tree, and Winston in 1984 discovered a fleeting spark of love with Julia, Marius and Cosette's relationship reveals the most tender and vulnerable parts of the human soul. In the early 19th century, Paris was boiling with unrest. Poverty, injustice, and inequality had reached unbearable levels. The people's patience was wearing thin, and among the youth, the ideals of freedom and equality were spreading like fire. Secret groups in the city, especially the Friends of the ABC, were preparing for revolution. One of the most passionate members of this circle was the young lawyer, Marius Pontmercy. Carrying the republican ideals of his father, Marius no longer struggled only with his personal identity, but also with the future of society itself, building the barricades. As the anger of the people grew, barricades began to rise across the narrow streets of Paris. Workers, students, and the poor dragged carts, stones, and furniture to block the roads. The barricades quickly became symbols of resistance. The leader of the group was Enjolras, a fiery young idealist ready to give his life for liberty. Alongside him were his loyal friends, Combeferre, Courfeyrac, Feuilly, and others, young men burning with the dream of justice and revolution. Marius joined them at the barricades. Torn between his love for Cosette and his duty to his country, he nevertheless believed deep down that fighting for justice was the right path. Life on the barricades. Life behind the barricades was harsh. Food was scarce, weapons were few, and danger grew by the hour. Yet the young rebels kept their spirits alive by singing, joking, and standing side by side with courage. Among them was Gavroche, the street urchin, who seemed to carry the soul of Paris itself. While bullets whistled overhead, Gavroche ran fearlessly into the streets, collecting gunpowder and cartridges from fallen soldiers. His laughter, echoing in the chaos, became a spark of hope in the darkest of nights. Jean Valjean's decision. Meanwhile, Jean Valjean arrived at the barricade. His reason for being there was different. He wanted to protect Marius. For Valjean, Cosette's happiness depended on this young man's survival, but fate had another test in store. Among the rebels was a prisoner, Inspector Javert. He had infiltrated the group, pretending to be an ally, but was unmasked and captured. The young revolutionaries decided he should be executed, and they entrusted the task to Valjean. Here stood the man who had haunted Valjean's life, the unyielding shadow of the law. Valjean had every reason to seek vengeance, but as he faced Javert, he remembered the bishop's mercy, the act that had changed his life forever. Instead of pulling the trigger, Valjean chose a different path. He set Javert free, whispering words of forgiveness. In that moment, he proved that he was no longer driven by hatred. He was a man reborn through compassion and mercy. The fire of revolution. The fighting grew more brutal. Cannon fire shook the barricades, and the rebels fell one after another. Still, their courage never wavered. They fought for an idea, even knowing that defeat was inevitable. In one of the most heartbreaking scenes, young Gavroche dashed into the open to gather more ammunition. Singing defiantly as bullets rained down, he was struck and killed. His death embodied the tragic cost of innocence and bravery in a merciless world. Through it all, Valjean searched for a way to save Marius. Amid the smoke, gunfire, and falling comrades, one thought consumed him. If Marius died, Cosette's light would be extinguished too. The barricades of Paris had become symbols of resistance, built with carts, stones, and broken furniture. But the government forces were too powerful. With cannons, soldiers, and merciless orders, they attacked the rebels. The young men fought with incredible bravery, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. One by one, their companions fell, and the flames of revolution dimmed. Enjolras and his friends fought until their very last breath. Their courage stood as proof of how far human beings will go in pursuit of freedom. Yet when the barricades collapsed, only a handful of brave but defeated fighters remained. The rescue of Marius. In the middle of the chaos, Marius was gravely wounded. Bullets tore through him, and he collapsed, bleeding into the cobblestones. It seemed impossible for him to survive. But then, Jean Valjean appeared. Driven by his promise to Fantine and his love for Cosette, Valjean carried the unconscious Marius on his back. Through smoke, gunfire, and destruction, he searched for a way out. At last, he descended into the sewers of Paris. The darkness, the stench, and the endless tunnels were like a mirror of his own past, filled with filth, shadows, and suffering. Each step reminded him of the chains he once bore, but now he walked with purpose. On his back lay Cosette's future, embodied in Marius. The final encounter with Javert. Emerging from the sewers, exhausted but determined, Valjean found himself face to face with a familiar figure, Inspector Javert. For years Javert had hunted him relentlessly. Now the man he pursued stood before him, vulnerable, carrying the wounded Marius. Valjean pleaded, "Let me take him to the hospital. He must live. Cosette's happiness depends on him." Javert, a man of unshakable loyalty to the law, was torn for the first time. The world he believed in was clear. Criminals must always be punished. But Valjean's eyes told another story, a story of change, redemption, and mercy. In that moment, Javert hesitated. He allowed Valjean to go free with Marius. For Javert, this act shattered his worldview. The man he thought irredeemable had shown humanity, while he, the servant of the law, was trapped in a rigid, merciless system. Unable to reconcile this contradiction, Javert later chose to end his own life by throwing himself into the Seine. Love's triumph. Marius eventually recovered from his wounds, thanks to Valjean's sacrifice. The love between Marius and Cosette blossomed fully, and they were finally married. Their union symbolized hope and renewal after years of suffering and despair. For Cosette, who had once lived as a servant girl in misery, marriage to Marius was like stepping into the sunlight after a long night. For Marius, Cosette was not just a beloved woman, she was the reason to live, to dream, to believe again. Jean Valjean's silent farewell. Yet for Jean Valjean, happiness came with sorrow. He believed that his past as a convict would stain Cosette's new life. Out of love, he decided to slowly withdraw, distancing himself so she could have peace and dignity with Marius. In his final days, Valjean lived in solitude, weakened but at peace with his choices. On his deathbed, he looked upon Cosette and Marius with tenderness. He knew he had fulfilled his promise to Fantine. He had protected her daughter and given her a future. The last breath. As he prepared to leave the world, Valjean's mind returned to the bishop's words, the words that had first lit the flame of redemption within him. From now on you must be an honest man. With a final serene smile, Jean Valjean passed away, his soul freed at last. The legacy of Les Misérables. Les Misérables is not only the story of Jean Valjean, but also the story of human suffering, justice, mercy, and the possibility of redemption. Victor Hugo shows us the cruelty of society, the pain of the poor, and the transformative power of compassion. The novel leaves readers with an unforgettable message. Even in the darkest times, a single act of kindness can change a life, and perhaps the world. Final words. Jean Valjean's journey reminds us that no one is beyond redemption. His story is not only about suffering and sacrifice, but also about the eternal strength of mercy and love. Les Misérables stands as one of the greatest masterpieces of world literature, a mirror held up to humanity, urging us never to forget the power of compassion, justice and injustice. One of the most powerful themes of Les Misérables is the question of justice. Jean Valjean is condemned to 19 years of hard labor for stealing a single loaf of bread. This punishment reveals how harsh and merciless the laws of the time could be. Hugo shows us that laws do not always bring justice. Often they become weapons that crush the poor even further. In this way, the novel is not only the story of one man, but also a critique of an entire era's understanding of justice. Hugo invites us to reflect. What is true justice? The command of the law, or the voice of conscience? The power of mercy. The act of mercy by Bishop Myriel lies at the very heart of the story. By sparing Valjean and gifting him the silver, he transforms a bitter ex-convict into a man who chooses compassion. Hugo reminds us that a single act of kindness can ignite light even in the darkest of hearts. Fantine's story reinforces this theme as well.
While society cast her aside, only Valjean showed her mercy. Her life demonstrates that a person's true worth is not defined by society's judgments, but by the purity of their heart and their capacity to love. Love and sacrifice. Love is portrayed as the most transformative force throughout the novel. Valjean's love for Cosette gives him a new purpose, healing the wounds left by years of injustice and suffering. Cosette's smile becomes the light that brightens his once darkened soul. Meanwhile, the love between Cosette and Marius blossoms in the shadow of revolution, showing that even in times of despair, love can create hope. Yet love also demands sacrifice. Fantine gave everything, her beauty, her health, even her life for her daughter. Valjean, too, sacrificed his own happiness, stepping aside so that Cosette could live freely with Marius. True love is not possession, it is letting go, humanity and hope. At its core, Les Misérables is a story about the human soul. Hugo insists that even the most broken person can be redeemed. Valjean is the living proof. Once filled with anger and hatred, he was transformed by an act of compassion. The novel teaches us that society cannot truly progress unless it embraces its most vulnerable members. When society turns its back on the poor, it loses its humanity. But when it chooses kindness, there is hope for everyone. Literary legacy. Since its publication in 1862, Les Misérables has held a unique place in world literature. It is not just a novel, but a social manifesto, weaving together history, philosophy, politics and love. Adapted into countless plays, films and musicals, Hugo's masterpiece continues to move millions of readers and viewers across generations. Few works have captured the struggle between justice and mercy, despair and hope, with such power. The eternal message.
At the heart of Les Misérables lies a timeless truth. No matter how dark a person's past may be, love and compassion can lead to redemption. It is a novel that reflects both the darkest and the noblest sides of humanity, reminding us that real happiness comes not from power or wealth, but from bringing light and kindness into the lives of others, beyond just a novel. Victor Hugo's Les Misérables is far more than a novel. It is the conscience of an era. Since its publication in 1862, it has reached millions of readers, been translated into countless languages, and secured its place as one of the greatest masterpieces of world literature. In this monumental work, Hugo doesn't merely tell the story of one man. He paints a vast portrait of 19th-century France, the suffering of the poor, the cruelty of unjust laws, and the internal battles of the human soul. Les Misérables becomes more than a personal narrative. It transforms into the shared memory of humanity. Social critique. At its core, Les Misérables is one of the most striking critiques of social injustice ever written. Hugo reveals how the poor are crushed, how the law can serve as an instrument of oppression, and how society often turns its back on its weakest members. Every character embodies a facet of human nature or social reality. Valjean represents mercy and redemption. Javert symbolizes rigid justice without compassion. Fantine reflects despair and social cruelty, while Cosette stands for hope and innocence, the literary power of hope. Despite its tragedies, the novel carries a powerful message of hope. Hugo reminds us that even in the darkest heart, a seed of goodness can survive and blossom when nurtured by compassion. A single act of kindness, like Bishop Mariel's gift of silver, can transform a life, and in turn change the lives of many others. Jean Valjean's story proves that human beings are capable of rebuilding themselves, no matter how dark their past may be. This is why Les Misérables is regarded not only as a French classic, but also as a universal treasure of humanity. Reflections in art and culture. Since its first publication, Les Misérables has been adapted countless times for stage, film and musical theatre. Its world-famous musical has moved audiences across the globe, ensuring that Hugo's story continues to resonate with new generations. The novel stands as a monument to the transformative power of art. Through Hugo's words, the pain, hope and compassion of humanity echo across centuries. The eternal message. At the heart of Les Misérables lies a timeless truth. No matter how dark someone's past may be, through love and mercy, they can be reborn. Jean Valjean's journey is not only about personal redemption, but also about the possibility of a better, kinder society. His life is proof that true happiness does not come from power or wealth, but from bringing light into the lives of others. And so Les Misérables continues to live on, not just as a novel, but as an eternal masterpiece that speaks to the conscience of humanity. If you enjoy these in-depth book summaries, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to stay updated. Every week we'll bring you a new masterpiece from world literature,